Okay, so last week we finished up our study on Sarah, the wife of Abraham. And as we concluded last week, we noted that the events regarding the situation with Pharaoh and with King Abimelech, that they, at the very least, they deceived those two kings, while they didn't necessarily tell a lie in that Sarah was Abraham's half-sister. It was omitting important truth that they needed to know, that she was married, and it was deceitful. And it's strange to think of Abraham and Sarah as doing that, but based on what we read in the account, that is the situation, and there's never an excuse or a reason to deceive, especially if as it appears in the event with Abraham, that it was out of fear for his life, that he was concerned that something was going to happen to him because of Sarah. That certainly was not, there's never a reason to deceive, but that kind of adds to the fact that you would think Abraham would consult with God before those events. We're moving on tonight to discuss Joseph, the husband of Mary. So that's where we have not yet started this, so we're starting it tonight. As we've been kind of going back and forth between Old Testament and New Testament, since we discussed Sarah, now we're discussing Joseph. Aside from just a few references throughout the rest of the or later chapters of the Gospels and the epistles and so forth, he's only really mentioned in Matthew chapter 1 and 2 and Luke chapters 1 and 2. We know he was from Nazareth, according to Luke chapter 2 and in verse 4. Nazareth being in the region of Galilee. Of course, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and there were some events in which that were taking place where they had to go to Bethlehem for the census and so forth, as we're told in Matthew, which we're going to look at here in just a minute. But according to Luke chapter 2 and verse 4, which I do actually want to look at that, because there is, and we'll notice this towards the end of our study, there is quite a bit of conflict among individuals concerning the different accounts of Jesus' birth, because they claim that they're different accounts. Not necessarily that they're the same account with just different details, but that they're different accounts, as if they're two different stories, which they're not. But Joseph went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. And so we see that he's from Nazareth. Now, going back to our notes, we see in Matthew chapter 1, verse 6 and in verse 16, as Matthew's laying out the genealogy and the lineage of Jesus, it shows that Joseph is a direct descendant of King David. We see that in verse 6 of Matthew chapter 1. How that Jesse, that's David's father, begot David, the king. And of course, this is going down on through Solomon and into through the captivity, verse 12, and into verse 16. Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Now, this kind of leads to the title of our study, which is Joseph, the husband of Mary. Why don't we call it Joseph, the father of Jesus? Okay, it wasn't his biological father. Okay, he was not related by blood in that sense to Joseph. Jesus wasn't. But that's why it's very interesting how that the scriptures make it clear how that Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. Not of Joseph, but of Mary was born Jesus, who was called Christ. So it's important to note that particular aspect as well. And there are some aspects to that we're going to discuss here in just a minute. So there's another genealogy in Luke chapter 3. Now, we're not going to go through and look at both genealogies and compare and contrast. That's not really the point of this study. But other than King David and everything before him, everything's different save for the captivity lineage, which included Shealtiel and Zerubbabel. We have completely different individuals. We're not just talking about different spellings of the same people's names. We're talking about different people. Everyone else, other than, again, Shealtiel and Zerubbabel from David, are different. Luke chapter 3 is considered the genealogy of Mary, showing Jesus to be the son of David through both blood, that would be Mary, and through legality inheritance as well, which would be Joseph. So you have Matthew chapter 1, which gives us Joseph's genealogy, so that nobody could argue that legally Joseph wasn't the son of David, okay, because he was legally the son of David through Joseph. They can't argue that he wasn't the actual blood of David because he was through Mary. And I think that's very important to note, because in Luke chapter 3, there is one point here in Luke chapter 3 that is important to note. Starting in verse 23, Jesus himself began his ministry at about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph. Okay? Now, that part about being supposed the son of Joseph, everything after that, the son of Heli, the son of Mathat, the son of Levi, we know that Joseph's father's name was what? From back in Matthew 1, what was Joseph's father's name? Jacob. Okay? Jacob isn't listed here, it's Heli, or Heli, or however you want to pronounce that. It would seem that this is clear that this is Mary's lineage, because as was supposed, he was the son of Joseph, but by blood, by reality, the son of Heli through Mary, and then Mathat, Levi, Melchi, and so forth. Going on through, as I mentioned, Zerubbabel and Shealtiel all the way back. So both sides of that equation are covered in terms of any type of Jewish argumentation that Jesus didn't actually fulfill the prophecies of being a son of David. Both sides of that are covered. Thoughts or comments through that? Right.
There's too many names, too many perfect lists
right.
of this that can't be false.
Well, and what's great about this, and you talk about genealogy, this might be, at least in terms of length, one of the longest genealogies, that at least in terms of the record of the New Testament. Okay, because Jesus is traced all the way back not just back to David, but in Matthew back to whom? Abraham, and then I think it's in Luke, that goes all the way back to whom? Adam. Okay, so I mean, it's very comprehensive, like you say, and it's also very obvious that we're dealing with two different genealogies, or two different bloodlines. Again, of the same tribe, okay, of the same tribe of Judah, but of different bloodlines of that tribe. And it would seem clear that we're dealing with both parents, okay, Mary, the mother, and Joseph, legally the father, which I think is just, it just provides such a assurance, especially when the genealogies were still a big deal. And of course it is, for our perspective, because of the prophecies. But even without the prophecies, in Jewish life, before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, genealogies and ancestry were everything. Being able to trace your lineage back to Abraham was everything. Of course, after the destruction of Jerusalem, everybody's records were pretty much destroyed, and nobody could really trace it back to Abraham after that from a manuscript perspective, which is ironic, given the fact that to this day, Jesus might very well be the only one who can, because all the other records have been destroyed for everybody else. Any other thoughts or comments with that? Okay, so Joseph was a carpenter. We're going to see in Matthew chapter 13 and Mark chapter 6 that being mentioned. However, interestingly enough, the term carpenter in the New Testament that's translated carpenter actually means artisan, one who is skilled with their hands. So while carpentry is one occupation of an artisan, there are other occupations that it could have been without being carpentry. Okay, there was metalworking, there were several different aspects of what it could all have been involved in under that subcategory of being an artisan. It's just because it was initially interpreted carpenter, that has kind of been the thought process all along. Instead of just saying artisan, artisan is very broad. Carpentry is tends to be more specific. But we know Joseph was a carpenter. This is Matthew chapter 13 and in verse 55. Matthew 13, verse 55. Verse 54, when he had come to his own country, he taught them in their synagogue. So they were astonished and said, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And his sisters, are they not all with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And so, verse 57, they were offended at him. Jesus came from what would be considered kind of a lowly background. Having the knowledge that he did of Old Testament scripture, of prophecy, having the wisdom that he had to apply it the way that he did, obviously came from Jehovah, came from the Father, but from their perspective, how can this man know these things? He can't possibly have been taught all of this. He can't possibly have been trained in these things. So where did all this come from? Incidentally, we also see the names of his other brothers, and these are the only ones, if there were any other brothers, these are the only ones we know the names of. But it sounds like there were 5 boys in all. There was Jesus, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and apparently plural sisters, at least 2. And his sisters, are they not all with us? So however many sisters that would have been. But it is kind of interesting that they say, is this not the carpenter's son? Is his mother not called Mary? We have the same event, which describes some more detail. This is Mark 6, I believe that's what, verse 35? Is that what I have on the notes? I think it's verse 35. What verse is it? Sorry, 6:3? Yeah, you're right. I don't know why I was thinking 35. Okay, so we have something similar here. He went from there, came to his own country. His disciples followed him. The Sabbath had come. He began to teach in the synagogue. They were astonished. Where did this man get these things? Verse 3, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they were offended at him. There's no reason to think this isn't the exact same event as what is listed in Matthew. The only difference is that in Matthew, the carpenter's son, and here, is this not the carpenter? Matthew and Luke could both be, or Mark rather, could be pointing out specific elements of what they said. So you put them together, and what you get is that they recognize that Jesus' father, as was supposed, was a carpenter. Jesus apparently was trained to be a carpenter as well, or an artisan, again, whatever that meant. We're going to say carpentry for the sake of argumentation here. That he was trained in carpentry as well, and presumably up until he was 30 years old and started his ministry, he was active in that field. It would seem, verse 3, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? So, he was known in the region of Nazareth and Galilee as being Joseph's son. Joseph was a carpenter, Jesus was a carpenter, and it makes sense because typically what did fathers teach their sons to do? Same trade that they did. We have examples of that here in our congregation, okay, with the Burses, Doug and Cliff and Jack. So you have that recognition that would have been logical, okay, and certainly I think the full recognition, the full statement from these individuals was, is this not the carpenter's son Joseph, the carpenter Jesus, the son of Mary? Okay, they recognized both of their vocations and who he was and what his family was and so forth. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir.
Yes, it just kind of struck me that them saying he was the carpenter's son, but
That's true.
That's not secret amongst the Jews. These are someone, a family that's known by the Jews.
Perhaps fairly prominent in that location.
Sure. So how could he be the Messiah?
Right.
Because they know him.
Yeah.
It's like when all the heathens were going on, it was someone they had known all of their lives.
Yeah.
The lame man, they've known him all their lives. How could he be up walking around unless it was a miracle
Right.
and everything? So
Well, and that's exactly what Jesus kind of references in the very next verse in both passages. He says a prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, in his own house, because they know you. Okay, when they see you, they don't see the 30-year-old Messiah preaching and teaching and doing miracles from God. What do they see? Yeah, they see that little kid running around. Okay, they don't see him as an adult, and not to say that Jesus was a rascal and doing bad things or anything like that, but they still see the young child. They don't see the grown man. And so that kind of that bias is there that prevents them from hearing what Jesus was saying because of their familiarity with him. And like you said, the fact that they were so well known, it could have very well have been that in Nazareth, maybe even in that region, Joseph may have been the only or one of the only carpenters or artisans in that region. And so it may have been that they were well known, not that they were wealthy or rich by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think that was the case. But that perhaps he was well known maybe because he was one of few in that particular area. I mean, if those are the only people around and you have to go to them to make whatever it is that they're making, then you're probably going to get to know them. All right, especially if you have to go to them a lot. So, it would seem as though they knew the family very well. Yeah, because they named all the sons and mentioned the sisters. So.
or the time when Jesus' mother came and he said, "Who's your mother?"
Yeah.
They knew who she was.
Yeah.
They saw her and they knew who she was.
Yeah, they're waiting outside for you. Yeah, that's right. Anything else through that? All right. So according to John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27, we have Jesus as he's hanging on the cross. What does he say to John, the apostle, the apostle whom Jesus loved? This is your mother. Okay, and from that very hour, John took her to his own house. Jesus, there's some question as to why wouldn't the brothers have taken charge there? But if Jesus was the firstborn, it was his responsibility. Okay, so he's giving her to John to take care of. But that also means that who apparently wasn't around? It would seem that Joseph wasn't around at this point. This has prompted most scholars to deduce that Joseph has died at this point. The last time we actually see Joseph living is when Jesus was 12 years old in Luke chapter 2 and verse 43. When Jesus stayed in Jerusalem and he was in the temple listening to the rabbis and so forth, speaking and the scribes. Joseph and Mary, they get back to where they were going. They look around amongst their relatives for Jesus. He's not with them. Can only imagine the fear they had. So they head back to Jerusalem and they're searching the whole city for him. They finally find him. But that's the last time that Joseph is ever mentioned in terms of living at that point. So by the time of John chapter 19 and in verse 26, when Jesus, I have to remember the verse I say before I talk because I'll forget. Start at verse 26. Verse 25, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour that disciple took her to his own home. Whether this was, I don't want to phrase that, the traditional way in which individuals were asked to take care of a loved one, okay, if that was all the dialogue there was, It may have been because it was recognized this is, in their culture, that's how they do that. Maybe it was simply that John recognized what Jesus was saying. Jesus didn't ask, at least in the dialogue we have, Jesus didn't go any further into detail, John, will you please take care of my mother? It was, behold your son, behold your mother. John took her as his mom, took care of her as his own mom. Now, it's notable here as well. Okay, there is a hymn that we sing that mentions this event. It's verse 3 of a hymn. Does anybody remember what that hymn was or is? 10,000 angels. Okay. Verse 3 says, he said, woman, behold your son. And just kind of as one of those important aspects of keeping in mind what we're singing when we're singing it. The hymn, it's as if the hymn portrays Jesus talking about himself. Woman, behold your son. Here I am. I'm hanging on the cross. I'm dying for you, and so forth. The hymn, the words of the hymn doesn't go into detail about it. So the hymn's not wrong. He did say that, but it's as if it presents it as if he's saying it about himself, and he's not. He's saying, woman, behold your son. This would seem to be to John. Okay, this isn't to him, because this is about John and Mary, not about Jesus and Mary, or even Jesus and John. And the fact that he says the exact same phrase, except behold your mother, to John, suggests that he was saying, woman, behold your son, to Mary about John, not about himself. And that's just something to think about. When we sing hymns, it's important that we recognize what the words are, recognize what the context of those words are, especially when they quote Scripture or events in Scripture, that we keep in mind what those events are. But that's kind of, I thought that was very interesting that at this point, if Jesus is the firstborn, which I believe he is, it would seem to be that there were no other siblings in existence before Jesus, that Jesus being the firstborn, the responsibility was on him to make sure his mother was cared for, and he gave her to John. Why that is specifically at this point, again, I don't know. We know that Jesus had a unique relationship with certain apostles like Peter, James, and John. Maybe that's one of the reasons. We know that his brothers, at least at one time, did not believe him. But as of Acts chapter 1, after he had been raised from the dead, Mary and his brothers were there. So maybe at this point, before he's raised from the dead, maybe the brothers are still, or some of the brothers aren't believing. I don't know. I don't know what the situation is here. It's just kind of interesting that Jesus told John, take care of my mom. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir.
When did John die?
John the Apostle in the 90s AD. John the Apostle died in the 90s AD.
Another possibility is Jesus knowing those kinds of things. There's a longevity there of care possible.
That could be. That perhaps he knew that some of the others wouldn't be around to take care of her long enough for her to live out her life. And so maybe knowing that John would be the last apostle, presumably to live, that maybe he gave her to John for that reason. That could be. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, it could be.
I've kind of always seen this as like a foreshadowing of the relationship with the church. You know, we are taught to take care of orphans and widows and look out for those who need looking out for.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus is kind of establishing that. We know, later on, like you said, Jesus' brother Jude or Jacob or whatever you call him was a prominent elder even in the Church of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, I don't know if he was part of that, kind of close group. But John was. And Jesus was kind of telling him to look out for those who need looking out for in the church.
Yeah, it could be. Certainly the characteristics we are to have as Christians that is being displayed here. And John doesn't question it. I mean, it's almost as if John was more than happy, more than willing to take care of Jesus' mother. And it would probably, I'm sure John was honored that Jesus would ask him. Okay, not to say that John was better than anyone else by any means, but I'm sure that was an honor for John to be able to say, yes, I'll take care of her, take her to his own home from that point on.
And love for one another that he didn't have for the other apostles.
It could be. It could be. You know, it's.
Talk about the one he loved and all.
Yeah, yeah. He loved all the apostles, but there were certain individuals he was closer to. We call it his inner circle sometimes. It's not that they were more important to him. He loved all of them. But with some people, you just kind of have there's a chemistry. You have a connection to. And because of that connection, that chemistry, sometimes those relationships are a little bit stronger than maybe other relationships you have. It doesn't mean you love them any less, but like Peter, James, and John, for whatever reason, those three tend to kind of feature prominently, and John especially, given that John describes himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. There would appear to have been, a particular closeness there. Yeah.
There's an occasion Peter even asked John to ask Jesus.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because it's like, John, if it comes from you, it'll get on Jesus' good side. If it comes from me, it won't. That's true. You're right. That's a good point. Yeah.
John was young,
He was.
very young.
Yeah.
Part of that was like a brotherly relationship.
It could be. It could be. Yeah, and it could be that relationship, because perhaps, again, we don't know all the ages of the apostles, but it could be that John was the youngest of them. He certainly lived the longest. We know that he got to the tomb before Peter did. Why? Peter was old and John was young, or at least there was a relative of age difference. And so it could be that Jesus and John had a kind of older brother, younger brother type of mentorship type of relationship that may have existed as well. And that's a good point, Seth, that his youth may have been a part of that. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that Jesus was the one that cared for his mother before he died?
Well, you see,
The one finding somebody now?
it is interesting because you see her with him at times in the Gospels. Now, whether or not she went with him everywhere, I don't know. Jesus may have entrusted his brothers who stayed at home, perhaps, to take care of his mother while he was in other places. But certainly in Cana, as well as other events where we see Jesus and his family there, I think he did take care of her when he was with her. I don't necessarily think she was following him along everywhere, though. Necessarily. I mean, it could have been. There were groups that just kind of followed Jesus everywhere, and she may have been part of that, but I don't know. Anything else through that?
She may not have needed that much care at this point in time. If
Yeah.
he's 30 plus,
Yeah.
she only would have been 50s.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah, you're right. She may not have needed that much care at that point.
Looking forward, though, to her older age.
Sure. And keep in mind, we know Peter had a wife and a mother-in-law already, okay, as of Acts chapter, where's his mother-in-law mentioned? Acts chapter 11, 12? Anyway, Peter's mother-in-law is mentioned. And so John, at this point, may not even be married yet. He may not have a mother-in-law yet, and he's certainly able to take care of her from that perspective as well. Anyway, it just kind of also lends itself to an interesting situation where Jesus, to look at it in human terms and a human perspective, even though Joseph wasn't his biological father, he was still his dad. Okay, the man who raises you, that father figure, that's kind of your dad. And Jesus lost he lost his dad. Probably, I mean, at least relatively young age. Okay, Jesus was 30 when he started his ministry, around 33 when he's on the cross at this point. At some point before that, if this deducement is correct, Joseph died. And for Jesus, to have to go through grief. Remember, we're told in Hebrews that he was tempted in all points as we are, yet without sin. It would make sense that Jesus would have to go through emotional grief. I mean, we see him going through that with Lazarus. I mean, the shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept, and that was over Lazarus. Okay? I tend to think Joseph, if in fact Joseph is dead at this point, I tend to think it happened before Jesus started his ministry. I would think that probably would have been recorded. Not that it would have had to have been. It's possible it could have happened during the 3 years he was teaching and preaching, but likely it was before that. So that by the time that the gospel account picks up with the beginning of his ministry, all the major events are given to us. But just to kind of think of this in human terms, that Jesus lost his dad, and the emotional effect that has on an individual, that's tough, and especially for someone young like that. I'm 37. Yeah, I'm 37, and I still can't imagine losing my dad. So it's a very tough situation for him to go through. Very human. Anything else through that? All right. So the last time we see him is Luke chapter 2, verse 43. So some secular history on this. Epiphanius, your guess is as good as mine. Around the 350s AD or so forth, he records that Joseph was the father of James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas via a previous marriage before Mary, and that he was betrothed to Mary when he was 80 years old. Now, there's absolutely nothing to substantiate that in Scripture other than the connection that Joseph, sounds like Joseph had died to that point. And the only reason that is any connection whatsoever is that, if Joseph were older, that would explain maybe why he passed away in that time frame. But you don't have to concoct something in order to make it make sense. I mean, this was 2,000 years ago. They had virtually no understanding of medicine. There was very little in terms of doctors and people to take care of you. If you got sick, your natural immunity had to fight it off, whatever herbs and stuff they had access to. But beyond that, there was nothing you could do. And so it was common for people in their 30s and 40s and 50s to die from disease. So it's not necessary to kind of draw out this whole backstory about James and Joseph and Simon and Judas. But I'll tell you, I think I know why this individual did this. Okay, Epiphanius, or however you want to pronounce his name, he was connected to what was becoming the Catholic Church. Keep in mind, the Catholic Church in organization and form didn't really exist until the 400s and 500s AD. We looked at that in our church history class. But it was already in its formation at this point. And one of the key components of Catholic doctrine teaches what about Mary? She stayed a virgin. Not only was Jesus born of a virgin, she remained a virgin the rest of her life. And I would tend to think that that's probably where this theory comes from. Because then that would explain Jesus' half-siblings. And so Jesus would have been the only child of Mary at any point, meaning she would have remained a virgin. And again, there's no reason whatsoever to think that. But you'd be surprised. The reason I include this is there's a lot of aspects to this concept of Joseph having been married before, Mary remaining a virgin the rest of her life, that are incorporated in some of today's religions, today's belief systems, Christian belief systems. It's interesting that even though it's very Catholic in origin, some, for lack of a better phrase, Protestant ideas incorporated some of these concepts. And so I think it's important to note that this is probably the origination of that not to say that Epiphanius was the first one to come up with the idea, but that this concept is what spawned a lot of that. Thoughts or comments? Yes, sir.
It doesn't say that Joseph taught Jesus to be a carpenter, but if we go with that assumption, then you've got Joseph being a carpenter at 80, and then not possibly teaching his son until he's 92
Yeah.
or more.
Yeah, you're right.
Possibly.
That would be...
So those numbers don't seem to add up, but...
You're right. You're right. Yeah, and when you...
It's just a dangerous thing to come up with a story.
Anytime you have to try to extrapolate stuff beyond Scripture, in order to make up an idea that you've already decided, you've already presupposed. I tend to think, of course, Epiphanius is writing this in the 350s. This is 350 years after the fact There's no way he had inside information that spoke to Jesus' origins that aren't told to us in the gospel. Okay, I'm convinced of that. So he's coming up with this on the basis that there was no way that he and those like him believed that Mary had any other children, because she was perpetually pure in that sense. Not that having a relationship with her husband made her impure, but for whatever reason, that's what they think. And so they come up with this idea to try to explain it. And when you have to concoct stuff like that, it's a very dangerous line to walk. Incidentally, as Seth mentioned, we do see at least James, the Lord's brother, being a prominent figure in Jerusalem as of Galatians and Acts chapter 15, which suggests that his brothers weren't incredibly elderly. They lived long enough into the 50s and 60s AD that, okay, they weren't, like 90 and 100 years old. So that certainly would lend itself as well to them being younger than Jesus, not older. All right, we will stop there. We will pick up with the actual accounts of Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2 with the character of Joseph. These are really the only places we have his character shown. We will pick up with that next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody.